I'll fix that picture.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Anne-Marie Schubert. I have the fortune of being the District Attorney for Sacramento County. Before we start this press conference, I want to acknowledge and introduce who some of the folks are, both in person and on the Zoom. In addition to myself, there's a number of elected district attorneys. That would be Vern Pearson from El Dorado County. I know Morgan Geyer from Placer County is here as well. I think I see Lisa Smitkamp from Fresno County, Kimberly Lewis from Merced County. I'm not sure yet, but perhaps San Diego District Attorney Summer Steffen, Stanislaus District Attorney Birgit Vladiger, Assistant District Attorney from Yolo County, Eric DeBroth, and there's a number of victim advocates as well here from various organizations. And then you were going to hear from a number of crime victims. Those include people both in person as well as via Zoom. So we have Nina Salerno-Basselman from Crime Victims United, along with her mother, Harriet. Shelly Cervantes from Citizens Against Homicide. Christina Barnes is here in person, Lance McDonald and Shelby Richie. Dina Love, Cindy Bolitnikoff, Kim Eggert, Michelle Corrigan. So I thank you all. If I missed anybody, I apologize for that, but we will do everything we can to make sure we acknowledge everyone that is here today. So I want to start off, before we actually start about kind of this particular reason we're here today, is to start with something that just came out today.
We are working in conjunction with CBS News on a poll series about issues affecting our state. The latest polling is about crime and crime prevention. Nearly all Californians say crime is an important issue, including more than 2 in 3 who consider it very important.
So that is a poll that came out just this morning, and many folks actually sent it to me. Let's be honest, people are concerned. And so we ask ourselves, why are we here today? Why are the folks here in person? And why are people here on Zoom from across California? We're here for really some pretty significant reason. 76,000 inmates, a number that is quite frankly staggering. Murderers and rapists and child molesters and serial offenders and serious and sexual offenders and violent offenders. Why are we here today? Because each of those inmates devastated the lives of so many in our state of California. Victims, their families, and at times entire communities. For those victims and their families, their lives, as we all know, will never be the same. As a prosecutor once said to me, the sunlight is never the same again for them. Yet at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon in April of this year, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation decided to ignore and decimate those rights, those crime victims' rights, by adopting what we now call so-called emergency regulations that went into effect less than 24 hours later. 76,000 inmates. How many hundreds of thousands of victims does that represent? Getting out of prison, and let's be honest, for doing nothing. Getting out early for doing nothing. Despite the promise by our government to rehabilitate them, our government is now letting them out early for, in fact, doing no rehab at all. Can you imagine that? Thousands of murderers and sex offenders in our prison system getting out early for doing nothing more than not misbehaving. At a time when we see today and pretty much every day on the news that violent crime in this state and in this country is surging. How is that safe for our society? It's not safety at all, quite frankly, it's insanity. How exactly is that actually helping those inmates, telling them that they can do little to nothing, to no rehab, and still get out in essentially less than perhaps half of your sentence, a sentence handed by a judge, down by a judge in a courtroom in this state? As prosecutors, we stand in courtrooms every single day across this state, every single day, to stand up for crime victims and to stand up for public safety. How exactly do these emergency regulations do anything for crime victims? Why exactly did the Department of Corrections impose these new rules, what I call the get out of jail free cards, to inmates without ever once hearing from crime victims? It's not a monopoly game. This is real life, and consequences of crime are real. Crime victims and the public had a legal right to be heard before our government made massive changes to sentences handed down by judges. In a historic move, this last May, 45 elected district attorneys across California joined together to stand up for crime victims and to stand up for public safety in the state of California and to sue the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to stop this madness. Today, we are here to announce that in addition to those 45 elected district attorneys across California, crime victims across this state are now joining this lawsuit. Why? Why are they joining? Why can't the DAs stand alone and stand up for victims? Because the Department of Corrections and the Attorney General's office somehow want to continue their efforts to destroy victims' rights and to deny their right to be heard. Because this is not a game where lawyers from the Attorney General's office try to manipulate the system to deny victims the opportunity to be heard before these massive changes were undertaken. Again, this is not monopoly, this is real life. Murderers, rapists, and child molesters should not be handed these get out of jail free cards without hearing from the very people that they victimized. I am proud to stand today, along with 45 other elected DAs, with Crime Victims United and Citizens Against Homicide, to stop our government and the Department of Corrections from further destroying their rights, those crime victims' rights, before we implement these massive changes. And with that, I am proud to now introduce the President of the District Attorneys Association and the El Dorado District Attorney, Vern Pearson.
Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you for all of you being here today, in particular those that have been affected by crime here in the state of California. As Anne Marie indicated, I'm Vern Pearson. I'm the DA of El Dorado County, and I also currently serve as the president of the California District Attorneys Association. For those who don't realize, the California DAs Association represents prosecutors, 3,500 prosecutors throughout the state of California, both district attorneys, deputy district attorneys, and deputies attorneys general, as well as deputy city attorneys. I'd like to read a quote to you. As Anne Marie indicated, this litigation was filed, and then there was a hearing on it. And during, or just prior to the hearing, the judge that's heard the case, hearing the case, essentially stated that we were right on the law. The DAs of California are right on the law. But the judge was concerned about something. The concern was that as elected district attorneys throughout the state of California, we represent the people of the state of California, all the people of the state of California. And the judge questioned in that whether or not we had what's called legal standing to represent individual victims of crimes, the individual victims themselves. So as Anne Marie, well, let me back up for a second. So that with that question in mind, there was a brief hearing. And I'm going to read a quote to you from a Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Anthony Tartaglio. The court indicated that perhaps, this is a direct quote from the transcript of that hearing. The court indicated that perhaps a new plaintiff or new plaintiffs could be substituted in. Until new plaintiffs are substituted in, it would be improper to issue any sort of injunction. At this point, defendants have no idea who these hypothetical new plaintiffs would be, how many of them there are, whether there are any potential defects in standing that the new plaintiffs might have, whether such plaintiffs are even willing to prosecute this case, which, as we all know, litigation is expensive. Every time I read that quote, it makes me angry, because the new plaintiffs he's referring to are people who have been the victims of crime here in the state of California. That's who he's speaking to. Let me take it out of lawyer speak and translate it into what all of us should understand that he actually means. He means might is right. For those of you who heard that expression before, he is saying to crime victims, the mighty Attorney General's office here in the state of California will wear you down in litigation. You cannot afford to take us on, even if you're right. That's what he's saying. In other words, the judge, though the judge had just informed them they are wrong on the law, they, the Attorney General's office, argue that the California DAs, elected DAs, represent the people and not individual crime victims. Therefore, the AG's office has lined up an army of very smart and clever lawyers that will tie up California's crime victims in endless and expensive litigation. This is the taunt of a bully, plain and simple. As a former deputy AG, that taunt was both disrespectful of the other deputy AGs within that office, and it's disrespectful of crime victims. Mr. Tartaglio owes crime victims and his fellow deputy AGs an apology. He was also factually incorrect. There are smart lawyers in DA's offices throughout the state of California, in the Attorney General's office, and outside of the Attorney General's office in private practice that are willing to stand up for victims of crime. I suppose it could be said that today we are here answering Mr. Tartaglio's taunt by introducing some really smart lawyers and representatives of California's crime victims. With that, I'd like to introduce a very smart lawyer that I've had the pleasure to work with for more than 25 years in various capacities, Kent Scheidegger.
Thank you very much. I'm Kent Scheidegger. I'm the legal director of the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation, and I'm representing the victims groups in this case. Let me explain to you the legal basis of the suit and what the suit is alleging. California law has long provided credits to prison inmates for things like good behavior and work. And for credits for those sentenced to a term of years means an earlier release, and for those sentenced to X years to life, what we call an indeterminate term, it would advance the time in which they are eligible to be considered for parole. However, California law has also long limited these credits. There has long been a long-standing 15% limit by statute for most violent crimes, and there are prohibitions on credits for murderers and third strikers. So along comes Proposition 57, and it amends the Constitution to authorize the Department of Corrections to give credits and to promulgate regulations along those lines. But it did not repeal those statutory limits on credits, nor did it, on its face at least, authorize CDCR to contradict statutes. It also did not create an exemption to the laws regarding how regulations are to be promulgated. So as you've heard, they have this midnight announcement of immediately effective regulations, which create a host of legal problems. Issued without notice and comment, there is an exception in the law that does allow CDCR to adopt temporary regulations without notice and comment to meet its operational needs. So there's a lot of regulations involved in running a prison, and they can do those without the notice and comment, at least temporarily. But this is not an operational need regulation. This is a rule of substantive law regarding how long people are going to spend in prison for committing serious crimes. And these regulations contradict the statutes imposing limits on credits. So we had the original lawsuit by the district attorneys, which you heard about, and it raised primarily the notice and comment problem. The victims groups appeared as friends of the court in a hearing, bringing up the problem of contradicting the statute. And the trial judge, as Mr. Pearson explained, indicated there may be a problem with standing and suggested that an amended complaint adding new plaintiffs would fix that problem and eliminate the issue of standing. So the complaint filed today is the amended complaint suggested by the court. It adds victims groups who have members who are directly and adversely impacted by these regulations. The perpetrators of the crimes against them or against their deceased family members will lead to earlier release or earlier parole hearings. There are victims' families, both here and on Zoom, who have already been through that parole process and can testify as to what a wrenching experience that is. That, having to go through the murder of your family member and face the perpetrator once again is something that should not happen any sooner than necessary or any more often than necessary, which is exactly what these regulations do. So here are the legal claims in the lawsuit. First, carried over from the original lawsuit, the regulations are invalid because there is no applicable exception to the notice and comment requirement. Second, the temporary regulations were given a February expiration date, but the statute under which they were promulgated has a 160-day limit. There is no applicable exception that would extend them to February. Third, they are invalid because they contradict the statutes. Regulations are subordinate to statutes. Regulations cannot contradict statutes, and if they do, they are void. If the other side chooses to argue that Proposition 57 as a constitutional amendment actually does give CDCR the power to contradict statutes, then that is not a constitutional amendment. That would be a constitutional revision. California constitutional law recognizes a distinction between a revision and an amendment. An amendment can be adopted by initiative. A revision can be adopted only by constitutional convention. So if Proposition 57 really does give them the power to subvert statutory law, as I expect will be claimed, then that provision of Proposition 57 is void, is not validly adopted. So for all of these reasons, in addition to being atrocious public policy, these regulations are legally invalid and they should be enjoined by the court. Thank you.
Next up, we invite Nina Salerno-Basselman, Crime Victims United CEO and President.
Good morning. I am saddened to stand here today, but I'm not surprised. Governor Gavin Newsom, Attorney General Bonta, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and this entire administration, with all their policies, have done nothing but re-victimize victims of crime. They are more interested in releasing violent felons than protecting public safety. They are more interested in silencing victims' voices and their rights than supporting victims. And they are blatant and arrogant about it, as evidenced in the quote that District Attorney Pearson so eloquently explained. They don't care about victims. The administration has already released more than 12,000 violent inmates. These are murderers, rapists, serial violent inmates into our streets and into our communities. And this most recent policy will release 76,000 more for nothing better than waking up in the morning. As a crime victim, the day your loved one is murdered, the day a crime is perpetrated on you, burns a hole in your heart that is never healed. The release date of the perpetrator is ingrained in your mind because at least you know that there is some peace between the date they are sentenced and the date of that release. But that release date that is burned in your mind also reminds you that's the day your peace ends as a crime victim. When you treat release dates as arbitrary and capricious, as this administration has done, changing them on a whim, it's not only an affront and offensive to the crime victim, it is a threat to public safety. And that is evident in the rise and the wave of crime in California. Just this year alone, Los Angeles County is experiencing 95% rate increase in homicides. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't fear-mongering. This is real. This is real lives, real victims. Vicki Van Dyken who was just recently blindsided by these policies and devastated to learn that the murderer of her disabled brother, who kidnapped him, tortured him, forced him to dig his own grave, then buried him alive, was released just 13 months after his last parole hearing. Vicki couldn't join us today because the emotional and financial toll of fighting to keep the murderer of her disabled brother in prison has almost cost her her livelihood. Today, you will hear from a number of crime victims whose lives have been impacted by our state's policy and are about to be impacted by our state's policy. There are countless others that couldn't join us today, simply because the toll has been too great. This lawsuit that Crime Victims United is proud to stand with the District Attorneys of California with is to stop this injustice and bring back balance into our criminal justice system. Governor Newsom, Attorney General Bonta, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and the entire administration have overstepped their bounds, and they continue to re-victimize victims and jeopardize our families and our communities, and it must be stopped. There are no words to describe what it's like to be a crime victim. There are nothing that can talk to you about the fear that lives within a crime victim. I know that firsthand. My sister was murdered in 1979 when she was stalked and brutally murdered on her first day of college. Yesterday, I dropped my daughter off at her first day of college. And instead of celebrating what should be every parent's joy, all that ran through my heart and my mind was the fear of her being murdered. Because of these policies, the murderer of my sister will be released early. This administration seeks to upend everything that is about justice. However, what they didn't count on, what Governor Newsom, the Attorney General, and CDCR did not count on, is the strength and resilience that can only be found in a crime victim. And we will fight for justice, no matter the cost, no matter the size of the army the state wants to bring onto us. We will stand tall and we will prevail for public safety and victims. Thank you.
I need to change it to victims. I mean, the Zoom. Hold on a second. No, I know that, but I need to change it so she's a speaker view, correct? No. Okay. All right, next up, sorry about that delay, is Shelby Cervantes from Citizens Against Homicide. Shelby, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share a few words from Citizens Against Homicide. CAH not only represents countless families of homicide victims, but our organization board is comprised of victims as well. We know all too well the attack victims' rights has been under for the last several years. The woes of the Department of Corrections cannot be remedied by solely placing the burden of those woes squarely on the shoulders of victims. The price we have paid to this point is heavy. The losses we have endured are forever and felt every single day. Muting our voices sends a clear message that what we endure in perpetuity is of no consequence to the system intended to protect us and our rights. If victims are not part of important regulatory discussions, then the system of justice is unmistakably broken. One can look at and read the text of regulation. However, one cannot see the faces of our dead or see the despair our victims share since losing them to murder. For a brief moment, put yourselves in our shoes. Would you not want to be heard in matters that directly impact the justice you rightfully deserve? Ask yourself whether being silenced in regulatory matters have a direct impact on you as a victim, does not further victimize you. Then ask yourself, how do you suggest the harm caused by not being heard is not irreparable? It is our sincerest hope these statements made today are taken under careful consideration in reaching the ultimate decision. Thank you.
Okay, next up, I think, is Christina Barnes.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. After 12 years, it's still hard to get up here and talk about this. Okay. My name is Christina Barnes and my mother's Cindy Ramos. I'm sorry. Ugh. My mother, Cindy Ramos, was murdered August 6, 2009. She was 58. My mom was killed in a premeditated attack by two men that called themselves her friends. She was blindsided as they asked her to sit in a chair and close her eyes under the pretense of getting a necklace for her birthday. That necklace turned out to be a cord they strangled her with, followed by 55 stab wounds. Followed by 55 stab wounds from a knife they brought to carry out that vicious attack. Her head was bludgeoned and bashed in 13 times. Evidence was overwhelming, and her killers accepted a sentence of life without parole. As we all know, life without parole means they shouldn't qualify for this early release. But let's be real. Open this door to early release, and where will it stop? Shouldn't it have stopped with the final outcome after a court case was reviewed and on the table in front of a judge and/or a jury? Shouldn't that be the end-all, be-all? How can we as a society respect our authority when we see the sentence handed down by a judge can be completely disregarded? Don't you think that if this goes forward, that someone somewhere won't be trying to add to the next wave of releases? One might say they were discriminated against for not being considered for early release in this round, or they now identify as nonviolent. Call me crazy, but crazier things have happened. You are disregarding the justice system we have in place and rewriting it to fit an agenda. You are opening a door by showing our system can be manipulated, and that door leads to our backyard and our front yards where our children play. And where are the victims in this process now? Are they even a thought? What about the families who have already suffered the unimaginable pain of losing someone to violence, reliving it with courthouse nightmares to get to a resolution that is supposed to include justice according to the laws we have in place, just for some bureaucracy to rip that justice out from underneath them? The 76,000 offenders up for early release have been adjudicated. They went through a court process and were handed a sentence for their crime, which is but a small semblance of justice for their victim and the family. Some victims can no longer speak because the offender took that right away from them. I know those are words you've heard before, but do you understand what it means to someone like me? My mom was murdered. Her killers left her lifeless body on a floor in a pool of blood. She had 6 children who love her dearly. And the thought of her dying alone is unimaginable to every one of us. Aside from the fact that her mother's life was taken, she died alone. No one was there to hold her hand as her life slipped away. Not one of her kids could be there to save her, let alone tell her how much she was loved or what a good job she did. She died as a result of someone who chose to take her life violently. She died in unimaginable fear and pain. She no longer has a voice because her killer silenced her voice forever. So it's people like me, family members who already carry a lifetime of unresolved grief and trauma that must stand up and advocate for our loved ones. I will always be that voice for my mom and for others like me who live this. I'm not done, I'm sorry. 76,000 is an astronomical number, especially when considering the magnitude of some of their crimes. Murder, rape, and violent crime are all on the table. How can anyone in good conscience even put that on the table and release these known violent offenders back into society? Let me say that again. murderers, and rapists. These are the greatest crimes known to man and God. Crimes that were handed a punishment that doesn't even make the situation whole again. Yet here we are, begging you people who made the decision to steal away justice from victims and their families to rethink this. You have a responsibility to keep us all safe. Does this mass release do that? We know the majority will reoffend. According to the CDCR in 2012, 65% of those released from prison returned in the first 3 years. 65% of 76,000 comes to an estimated 49,400 crimes we can anticipate in the next 3 years. How many of those crimes will have devastating effects unnecessarily? How many lives will be put at risk unnecessarily? Are you willing to gamble away the safety of your own citizens to save money? And more importantly, where is that money going that's more important than keeping California safe? I implore you, find those monies elsewhere. Further, both my mom's killers were repeat offenders on mostly nonviolent crime. The mastermind that planned the attack was facing a possible third strike in prison when he swindled his way out as a confidential informant on what turned out to be a bogus deal he concocted to get out early. Rightfully, he should have went to court and faced his crime. If he had, my mom might still be alive and I wouldn't be here today. So my mom, Cindy Ramos, is the face of an early release. Maybe a different circumstance, but an early release nonetheless. My mom would be 71 this coming Sunday. Last year, we held her 70th birthday party at the cemetery. We had food, tables, balloons, flowers, and music, and all the things that should encompass a birthday party, minus the guest of honor, added the tears and the fact that it's held in a cemetery. Life is forever changed, and the only justice we can hang on to is the fact that her killers are behind bars. Countless families are now facing unfathomable turmoil with this early release while our communities are put at risk. I am but one surviving family member. My mom had 6 kids, 9 siblings, countless grandchildren and nephews and nieces who would all feel stolen justice, just as every surviving victim and family member for those crimes that are now being swept under the rug. There's no way to accurately count the number of the number of people this will affect and put at risk. So I ask you to look at the true faces behind the numbers. The face does not belong to the 76,000 offenders up for release. The face belongs to that of the victims, their surviving family, and their victims inevitably to come. Sorry.
Just as a side note, when Christina says that, you know, her mom's killers were sentenced to life without parole, it's not crazy to think that that will someday turn into a parole date, because this year alone, as many of my colleagues know, there was a bill that worked its way through the legislature to try to get those folks out of prison after just doing 20 years. So when we start talking about the face of what's unfathomable, it's a reality that this is what the effort is. And with that, the next speaker I'd like to invite up is Lance McDonald and Shelby Richie.
I'm going to let you go first.
You sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. I want to thank everybody for being here and fighting for us and other victims. My name is Shelby Richie. The day after my 18th birthday, the love of my life was killed by a repetitive DUI offender. My boyfriend, Logan McDonald, who was just 19 years old, was taken away from us on June 16th, 2017 by a man named Marcus Noble Gifford. With multiple DUI priors and a suspended license, Marcus struck and killed Logan while he was riding his motorcycle 2 minutes down the road from my home. He died 2 minutes after I kissed him goodbye. I'm still haunted by the words when I got the call. Our best friend uttered to me through tears, "Logan's dead, Shelby." I had to take the long road home for 3 years because his cross on the side of the road haunted me. I still hold on to his clothing and belongings in my closet, unable to let them go. Logan was my everything and the person I wanted to spend my life with. I loved him more than the words I'm speaking can describe. The memories I have of him are all I have left, thanks to Marcus Gifford. Through intense grief and sadness, Logan's family and mine spent 1.5 years fighting to put Marcus Gifford away in prison for the life he so recklessly took. We attended every court case, enduring prolonged grief and digging our wounds deeper. After receiving a sentence of 10 years in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we felt like we had finally received the justice we so desperately deserved as victims. After only spending 2 years in a California state prison, he was released early on July 31st, 2020. It felt like a spit in the face to Logan's family, the community, to me, and every other citizen that believes the state will protect its citizens from repeat offenders who obviously have no consideration for other human lives. We felt like Logan's life and our suffering meant nothing. Marcus Gifford immediately reoffended after his release this year, arrested again for drinking and driving. No remorse, no consequences, and no change. We once again endured more court appearances that brought up more grief and a strong feeling of absolute injustice when Marcus Gifford should have been sitting in a prison cell. The justice system works until you are in the middle of it. The revolving door is real. We didn't realize how much the CDCR placated the criminals without any consideration to the suffering victims. The lack of justice within the facilities that have sworn to hold these criminals accountable and protect our communities has let down my family and this entire state. They have shown all victims that their traumas are invalidated and insignificant by continuing to release these criminals out to reoffend and ruin other lives. I am only one of thousands of victims in this state that have endured the same injustices. They should be taking care of victims, not creating more. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation have let down my family, this community, this state, and Logan McDonald's life. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity for allowing us to speak today. That's pretty much all the context right there. I would like to add that due to Logan's death, let me step back real quick, during the first trial, the judge had asked me where my wife was. And I said, well, she's sick. And he said, is she going to be okay? And I had to turn around and tell the judge, no, she's not going to make it. Her cancer that she had survived to begin with had come back due to the loss of her son. Her immune system dropped, and that was it. 11 months and 3 days after my son's death, my wife died at home in bed. So that alone was bad enough. He basically killed 2 people. But to have to go through this all over again, and my only remaining son became a Placer County sheriff because he wanted to make a difference for his brother and what had happened. So this, for him to only do 2 years after everything he went through to make a difference as a police officer, is like slapping him in the face. The day before he went to work, he gets a call from his sergeant letting him know that the young man that killed his brother is sitting in the same jail where my son works. It's deplorable. I mean, how could he even, in good faith, go out and continue to do his job when it seems like it's for naught? So the only thing I could say good about this is that my wife is not having to relive this experience all over again. And with that, thank you for your time. And
Thank you.
Next up is Dina Love.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I believe that sentencing guidelines are there for a reason. Why sentence a guilty person if the CDCR is only going to circumvent the judicial process and undermine the judge's rule and authority. These policies the CDCR want tell the victims and their families that their pain is invalid, that criminals have more rights than victims. Is that the message that they want to send to the public? Out for good behavior? It's a lot easier to be good in a controlled environment. The CDCR is re-traumatizing victims and their families with these policies, reliving the anguish and the pain wrought by the criminal, opening up wounds that have left scars and exposing those traumas to further injustice. These policies are a detriment to victims and their families in being able to come to terms with the suffering inflicted by the criminal. On February 28, 1998, my family was left devastated and shattered by the senseless killing of my brother, Johnny. When Teribia Williams was sentenced on July 31st, 2001, to 84 years to life in prison, there was a relief, almost as palpable as when she was found guilty, that she would essentially spend the rest of her life behind bars. Think about it, 84 years. That's essentially someone's lifetime. When we were notified mere days before her release on July 30th, 2020, those deep buried scars were ripped open anew. And to add insult to injury, we were told we wouldn't even be given the opportunity to speak against her release. Well, I'm speaking now. My brother's voice will be heard, even if I have to shout it from the rooftops. How dare the CDCR re-traumatize my brother by releasing his murderer? She spent less time in prison than he was alive. At 23 years of age, he had only just begun to live his life. Think about what you were doing when you were 23. Maybe you were graduating college. Maybe you were starting your career. Maybe you were getting married and starting a family. These are all things my brother wasn't given the opportunity to accomplish. There are people in our life that he will never know because he's dead now. And now, according to the CDCR, his murderer can now have a life that she denied Johnny. Shame on you, CDCR. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dina. Next up is Cindy Bolitnikoff.
Hello, thank you for having me this afternoon. I'm here as a member of the communities you live in, an educated and reasonable citizen who has been victimized by one of the violent inmates this time credit structure looks to reward. Were this to benefit us, the public, then the general collective might have been included, let alone informed of the changes prior to this being approved by the state offices of administrative law. The authority being exercised for this floodgate release of violent felons was perpetrated as an emergency regulation under the California budget, which also negates the opportunity for public comment. I have issues with reconciling that an agency of the state for which I have lawfully lived my entire life, paid taxes to fund the budgets of which have an agency that employs tactics that fail to present to us, California citizens, the reasonings and facts generated by sound research. The work copy should speak for itself. Yet this passed without mention until the moves have been played. The rate of recidivism or likelihood for a convict to reoffend are readily available. And rather than quote other people's research, I ask you to consider this. My grandfather was murdered in 1992, taken at an age considered late in life. He wore a blue collar, worked hard, and still helped people in his neighborhood. He was also the most heinous murder in Kings County to date, stabbed 63 times and his eyes were taken out. This were the last fleeting memories seen by a man beloved by not just his family, but his neighbors, friends, and community. The perpetrator of this time, now a convicted murderer, is suddenly eligible for increased good time credits. For perspective, this includes yet again the same violent inmate whom was caught selling methamphetamines and cocaine, you guessed it, while incarcerated, for a cruel ending to the life of my beloved grandfather, Hoss Harrison. Dealing drugs while serving a murder sentence deems him eligible and deserving of an expedited release. I can see why an entity funded by its state citizens would look to avoid any opportunity by the public to present an opposition. We will be heard through the diligent and tireless work of Crimes Victims United. We will be heard. Thank you.
I think hearing from the families of these victims, I think I would end this press conference with an ask, and that is to the Attorney General and to our governor to do the right thing. What's wrong? Oh, I'm sorry. Which one? Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I saw it. That's my fault. Okay, sorry, Michelle. Michelle Corrigan is up next. She's on mute, you guys. Can you let her know that?
Hi, I'm sorry. My apologies. I was actually not planning on speaking today. I have a lot to say, and I will be saying it. And I'm sorry. I'm not going to speak today. I'm sorry.
For Michelle and for all the other victims that spoke today, or those that could not speak because of the level of trauma this causes them, I again will end with an ask, which is to our governor and to our attorney general with this lawsuit, and that is to do the right thing, to stand up for victims and to stand up for public safety and to give them the voice they are legally entitled to have. And with that, I will open it up for any questions of any of the folks that spoke today.
We'll start with the media that are here, and then we'll go to Zoom. Any questions here? Okay, so we'll go to Zoom.
No questions. Thank you all for coming.